No, actually, very sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm informed that we have now gone live. So I think with that, I'm going to start the session. So just afternoon, it's so wonderful to see so many of you here in the room today and online. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr Natalie Byrom, and I chair the Civil Justice Council's newly formed Data Working Group. Now, you heard in the plenary the way in which, thanks to many of you on this panel and in this room, the issue of what the MR referred to as the long-term blight of lack of data on the operation of the civil justice system has risen up the policy agenda in recent years. And the aim of the Data Working Group is to provide a positive and sustained focus on this issue, charting gaps and holding decision makers to account for action. So in spring next year, the Data Working Group is going to be launching our first annual report, which will focus on the gaps in the data that's held by the courts. But over time, we want to expand our remit to look at the wider advice sector and do deep dives into particular issues. So if you work in a system and you're hampered in your ability to do research or deliver services or hold systems to account by gaps in data, we want to hear from you. We're really lucky to be joined for this session by an absolutely stellar panel who are going to help us explain why access to data is an access to justice issue, particularly in a cost of living crisis, highlight some of the excellent work that's underway in other jurisdictions and other settings, and to share emerging good practice into how we can fix the problem of missing data for good. So I'll start by doing brief introductions for the panel. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by Lisa Harker, who is Director of the Family Justice Observatory, which has a mandate to use data and evidence to improve the family justice system. We're also joined by Lex Jones, who is Chief Executive of the Registry Trust, Rosario Piazza, who now leads the Rowntree Foundation's new data and insights function, and they're doing some really innovative work in looking about how you use non-administrative data to understand people's lived experience of poverty, and the inimitable Fiona Rutherford, who is the Chief Executive of Justice, and they've published a lot of work recently looking at data gaps in those sessions. And we want to try in a range of areas across the justice system. So for the session, we wanted to try and make it as kind of conversational as possible. But we're going to start by me asking the panel a series of questions to reflect on their experience, and then move to questions from the floor and hopefully online. So the first question I wanted to ask panelists is, why is access to data an access to justice issue? And I thought maybe we could start with Lex before moving to Fiona and then to Lisa.
Yeah, absolutely. So my interest here is very much CEO of Registry Trust. And for those of you who haven't heard this, Registry Trust are the non-profit organisation that run the public register of judgments, orders and fines. As such, we get a daily feed of data through from the civil court system, and that information is used predominantly to go to credit reference agencies to support the dark art known as credit scores, but also, of course, anything and any industries involved in kind of due diligence decision making space. So that might be recruitment, that might be insurance. You know, basically, there isn't a decision that gets made somewhere in your professional lives or your financial lives that doesn't use Registry Trust data somewhere along the lines. So really, really important that that information that we have is full and complete. Not having full and complete information becomes a significant barrier to justice. That is because it will have impacts on your life, on your ability to open an account, to move house, to get a new job, anything that you can possibly think of. For me as well, if I think about it on a slightly grander scale, if I can, and for me, access to data is absolutely vital to the existence and support of a functioning justice system. Access to data means that individuals and organisations are empowered to hold institutions to account and to make sure the decisions they take are fair and reasonable. Not doing so continues the disenfranchisement of the most vulnerable in our society. I'm nervous, I'm soapboxing too much. I'm looking to Natalie to be like, do I stop? Do I keep going?
That's lovely. That's lovely. Would you like to share a little bit about your recent campaigns that you've been doing?
Absolutely, I would love to, thank you. The biggest campaign that I think is most relevant to everyone in Lisbon is the campaign to have claimant data added to the public register. So I said already, we get 99% of the information that relates to any county court judgments that come to us, but we don't get the name of the claimant. So what that means is I can tell you that you have a judgment against you, I can tell you the amount, I can tell you the date, probably tell you where you live, I can probably tell you your date of birth, just in case you don't know it. But I can't tell you who it is you need to pay back. Seems a bit odd. It's not really in the interest of claimants either, is it? Because actually, if I can't... And I was so brilliantly insightful too. I will try and start that again. Claimant data, yes, we don't get the name of the claimants on the register. Effectively, that means, you know, we'll get 99% of the information required, but we don't get who it is you need to pay back. Clearly, that is not useful for the claimant themselves because they are going to struggle to get paid. And I think we've heard earlier about the Pyrrhic victory of somebody winning a case and yet not actually receiving any funds off the back of enforcement action. So not very helpful from that perspective. But actually, this has broader implications too. Not having claimant data means there is a paucity of information that drives proper decision making. That happens for economists who don't understand kind of where the drivers of problem debt are within the economy. That creates issues for regulators who don't understand, are there key industries or are there key firms within those industries that are actually potentially driving bad behaviour or driving increases or decreases potentially in the numbers of judgments coming through. It has obvious impacts on the consumers because they're not able to readily pay off or deal with the debt in a speedy manner. It has issues for the courts, and because of course they are then having to deal with the circa 200 queries a week relating to people who need to phone up and find out who it is who actually took out judgments against them. And so significant challenges from that perspective. If I can have two more minutes, there we go. I think there are multiple examples, real life examples, and you can find them by checking out our Google reviews online. There you go. There are multiple examples of people who've left reviews saying how much we've helped them, etc. So they're from firms who said, amazing that you've rescued a trade credit line for us that was basically going to send us insolvent if we weren't able to get that judgment removed and updated from the record. But you've also got the individuals who are impacted as well. When I think about the individuals, I tend to go full bore onto the heartstring tugging kind of element. So I paint you the picture of the individual who's scrumped and saved, and feel free to make this you in this mental scenario. But I paint you the picture of the individual who's scrumped and saved, right? They've sacrificed their avocado on toast brunch. They haven't gone to the Instagram friendly holiday destinations doing it for the gram. And I do absolutely acknowledge that I am not cool enough to get away with that sentence, but just stay with me here for this. They have sacrificed so much, they have saved, and they are finally able to put a deposit down on a property that they can call their own. Well, their own and their mortgage providers for the next 30 years, but they can finally have a place to call their own. And then what happens? They get a phone call from the mortgage broker, mortgage offer's pulled, you have a judgment. Okay, panic, but actually don't panic, because 21st century, right? And everything is resolvable, everything is fine. So you phone the credit reference agency because that's who the mortgage broker told you to phone. So you phone them, credit reference agency can't help you. But actually they can tell you that you have a judgment in the record and the amount, etc. But they can't tell you anything else because they have to name the payment. Okay, who should we phone? Credit reference agencies. But why don't you phone Registry Trust? Because they supply us with the data. Fine. So they phone Registry Trust. They speak to some lovely people, and they do. My staff are fabulous. So they speak to some lovely people. But again, I'm so sorry. I can't give you the name of the claimant. I can give you almost everything else you need to know, but I can't give you the name of the claimant. And then we have to tell them the really bad news, which is you're going to need to phone the court. But if you're lucky, it won't be one of the busier courts in the UK, so you might only be on hold for an hour. And this is not meant to be a disparaging part for anyone in the courts, but it is a fact. You will be on hold for an hour. Except in this scenario, you're not lucky. Of course you're not lucky. So actually you've wasted a lunch hour, maybe 2 lunch hours, maybe 3. And all the time you are struggling. You've got your mortgage broker on the phone, demanding to know what's going on. You've got the vendor and the estate agent threatening to relist the property onto the marketplace. You've got friends and family making jokes about housewarming parties, and you don't know how to deal with that. All the time you are, let's remind ourselves, trying to hold down your job such that you can pay the mortgage should you be lucky enough to obtain it, despite the existence of a judgment that you knew nothing about previously. All of this, and I appreciate that this is a wildly emotive scenario that I'm coming up with here, isn't it? But it is also the reality of the situation that people deal with day in, day out. This is solely a result of a paucity of data coming through, something that is easily resolvable, easily fixable, would provide data and information through to regulators and lawmakers and policymakers, all else, but as well create solve a very real problem for individuals and small businesses everywhere.
Well done.
Thank you so much, Lex. And I mean, I think the example of your work really shows. I was really shocked when you first came to me and said that, because it just seems from a rule of law perspective, from an open justice perspective, the idea that we treat claimants differently from the way we treat defendants and the information that's available just seems extremely untenable. And it also has clear implications for what we heard about Claire and others talk on the earlier panel for early legal advice. We want to reduce pressure on the courts. We need to stop problem behaviour where it occurs. And if we don't know who's driving that problem behaviour, we can't fix it. I'd now really like to bring in Fiona. Now, Justice have recently published a fantastic report, which is looking at behaviour control orders in the courts. Now, this is an area that's been of real interest to the CJC. Previously, the CJC working group led by His Honour Judge Barry Cotter did a fantastic report looking at the use of antisocial behaviour injunctions, which is another area where we simply don't have any data on how they're used or what their impact is. So I wonder, Fiona, if you'd be able to tell us a bit about that work and why you felt that the lack of data on those orders was such an access to justice issue.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm going to start by giving credit to the person who actually did all the work with this report, which is one of our brilliant lawyers called Andrea Fraser. And I should just say, in general, justice in all of our work, I think pretty much all of the working party reports that we have published and other reports that we've published, certainly since I've been with Justice, which is nearly 2 years now, and certainly for the last 5 years, have found data gaps in every piece of work. And so it is a regular call from us to ask for better data or to solve those gaps. Natalie's very kindly mentioned the behaviour control orders, and just to quickly give you a definition, or our definition of what that means, which is they are the orders that are made by civil courts, but that if you breach them, you will face or could face criminal consequences, which could include prison. So loads of different orders have proliferated over the last 20 or so years. The most familiar and where it started was really in relation to ASBOs, which no longer, they've now moved into the antisocial behaviour injunctions that Natalie's just mentioned. But there are many, many more since the ASBOs started back in the early noughties. We now have orders that look to address antisocial behaviour in a range of ways: protests, drug use, knife possession, gang crime, stalking and sexual offenders. These are all things that some of which hit a criminal threshold, some of which do not hit a criminal threshold. And I've already mentioned that they're all going through the civil courts. There's a lot of variation behind these orders as to who they're actually made to protect: an individual, a public authority, the public. And there's also a huge range of conditions that can be applied. And I think it's fair to say that as part of our report, one of the most significant findings is that there's a lack of understanding across the board between police officers, police forces, public bodies as to what exactly is available to them, and then how to actually apply appropriately, as well as then to ensure that they are working. Despite this proliferation of orders, there's never been a systemic government-led review to see if they're working. Very little attention has been paid to whether the order model, I sort of do inverted commas for model because, as I say, there really isn't one, but if I can talk about them as a collective, and that's certainly partly due to the fact that when creating these orders, there appears to have been very little appetite to understand if they were going to work. And as a result, there's very little data that's been collected, and there's no central place or common way of recording when these orders are made. And it's really not clear how the effectiveness should be measured, or indeed what success looks like, which doesn't feel like a great starting point for something that you want to use more and more as a tool that you want to use more and more of. Just to give you a little bit more detail of the data gaps and indeed the implications of these data gaps. So we found that there's very little understanding of how many of those are subject to these orders who are neurodiverse or might have complex needs, including learning disabilities and mental ill health. And that's particularly troublesome in relation to antisocial behaviour, because issuing a community protection notice or a fine for breaching a public spaces protection order does not involve the court. That means that individuals who lack capacity in whatever form or have additional support needs are most certainly being criminalised for behaviours that they are almost certainly unlikely to be able to control. If these individuals are in the criminal justice system, those individuals would likely benefit from liaison to some extent and diversion services, something which of course is lacking in the civil context. Secondly, there's a disparate treatment between police forces and local authorities when it comes to recording ethnicity of those who are subject to the orders, which makes it really difficult to understand and identify racial discrimination. Thirdly, poor recording of the types of conditions imposed by the orders is really common. It makes it very difficult, therefore, to understand the trends in the efficacy of the different conditions. Which ones are being breached most recently, most commonly? Which ones are working? We simply can't answer these questions. And just to reiterate, these have been around, some of these, for nearly 20 years. Next, a lack of data sharing between police regions and local authorities, which makes it impossible to trace orders if someone moves from one area to the next, particularly concerning in the context of domestic abuse, non-molestation orders and stalking protection orders. And this was a problem that was the subject of a 2019 super complaint by the Centre of Women's Justice, which found that poor information sharing practices often meant that police were unaware that a non-molestation order had been imposed and was therefore unable to enforce it. And finally, current data practices also mean it's impossible to determine if someone is subject to more than one order. So if a local authority imposes an order and then the police come along and impose another one, partnerships are not sufficiently joined up to necessarily be aware of this. And if the public authorities are not aware of that, the chances are, going back to some of those more complex individuals in the system, the chances are that they will have absolutely no chance. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
That's brilliant, Fiona. Well, it's not brilliant, it's terrible, really, but thank you so much. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about these, we're talking here about gaps in administrative data, so data that should be held by the agencies who are delivering these tools. And when the Bureau of Investigative Journalism looked at this last year, again, they had to do their own investigations, relying on charities and investigative journalists to gather really basic information about the operation of these orders that are extremely consequential. I'd now really love to bring in Lisa, who's done such excellent work through the Family Justice Observatory, to really look at data and access to justice. And I'd really like to hear your thoughts on why you felt so strongly that this was an area that you wanted to focus on, and why access to data and access to justice issues.
Thanks, Natalie. I fear that I'm just going to add to the doom and gloom, because I'm not going to come and tell you that we've got it all right in the family justice system. As you well know, family courts make big decisions about the lives of children. Principally two kinds of decisions. They decide whether to remove a child from a family, or the arrangements for a child when couples are in dispute over their children. And we're talking about 84,000 applications to the family court every year across England and Wales. What is extraordinary is that those kinds of major decisions are made in the dark, really. The ability of a magistrate or a judge making such a difficult call balancing various risks that the child might be facing is taken in the absence of any information nationally about what might happen to those children when they make those decisions. So, you know, there's very little information provided to judiciary, courts, all the professionals who work in and around them about the outcomes for children for whom decisions have been made. And there's also very little information about the differences in the decisions that might be made at any one time. So a district judge here in London might make a decision today about whether or not a child returns to his or her family without any knowledge of whether they're making the similar sorts of decisions to judges elsewhere in the country. And surprise to surprise, when the observatory started to look at available data by piecing data together, we've just found endless examples of a postcode lottery, where it's far more likely for your child to be removed if you live in part of Manchester than if you live in a part of East London, despite the populations being very similar in terms of levels of population. So, you know, I always think of this as the equivalent would be giving no information to a surgeon making a sort of life-changing operation about the likely success rates of that procedure across the country. It's really making those decisions in the dark. And the judiciary themselves constantly say to us that we want to understand is the long-term impact of our decisions, so that we can take that context on board where we're trying to make these really finely balanced judgments. So for me, data is critical to making not just access to justice, but justice. You know, these are, there's real dangers that and evidence that people are not being provided with just decisions because of a system working in the dark. But it's also impossible for any of the oversight bodies, so I mean the MOJ, the Department for Education, the Family Justice Council, the President of the Family Division, to have any sense about what's going on without this data. And to look at, for example, the trends in the different characteristics of families who are ending up in the family court, how that's changing, the differences in the way that the courts are operating and making decisions, and of course those long-term outcomes. They don't have access to that information either. So as we heard this morning, I think there was an example given of, you know, decisions made on the basis of anecdote at a national level. Well, again, in family justice, that's also the case. And of course, if you're a user, if you're you come to the court as a litigant in person, most private law applicants do not have legal aid. You can't get any information on how the system operates either. And of course, in society more widely, there is very little information provided to us as citizens or journalists who find cases. I'm often contacted by journalists who said, I've come across these extraordinary cases. Is this typical? And I can't tell them whether it's typical or not, because we don't have any way of putting it into context without data. So, like it is the civil justice field, data is absolutely critical, and we can see it as a fundamental justice issue.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was just brilliant. And as I think you've all highlighted, I mean, data collection, changing the data that we have, it's about changing culture, and importantly, it's not a cost neutral exercise. It places a burden on court staff. Courts, unlike in the NHS, where you have dedicated teams of people who sit compiling statistics, it's not your doctor who's entering data into databases. There are people employed to do that. We don't have that infrastructure in the courts. And we know we're already overstretched. And it also places a burden on professionals. One of the issues that I increasingly encountered in my previous role was the burden that it places on frontline advice agencies of being, and Claire alluded to this in the plenary discussion, of being asked to collect different data in different ways by different funders. So I'd now really like, and of course the other issue is that administrative data, so data collected by government or by services, doesn't capture all of the information that we need to fully understand and fix access to justice problems. And so now I really wanted to bring in Rosario, who's been leading some really interesting work at JRF that's looking at how do we generate kind of timely insights into poverty, inequality, social exclusion from data that already exists in other forms. So I wonder if you'd be happy to tell us a bit about that.
Sure, thank you. And please make sure I stick with time when it comes to data. I could probably whatever. I'm a data geek. I love data, and yes, we do have a problem with data nowadays. If useful, I would like to give a bit of context as where we are coming from as a foundation at JRF, why we are trying to build an inside infrastructure. We talk about data, we talk about data gaps, and this is one of the most recurring debates that I've seen in the sector and beyond. We have too little information, we have too much information, right? So which of the two is right? Probably both, in the sense that the data that we have is not really accessible, is not user-friendly. You've probably seen plenty of examples, ONS, MOJ, you end up on a lovely looking dashboard, but then by the time you finish reading the content, you're living without even knowing why you end up there in the first place. So accessibility, it's issue number one. There is a lot of data that is treated in silo. You have government departments. It's the same in the charity sector. Don't get me wrong. Yes, we're really good at partnerships, but most of the time we don't really know which data we should be prioritizing. So what if we try to build an inside infrastructure, which is probably the best way to think about it is an analogy I always go back to. Imagine a sat nav. You want to go from A to B. There are so many different routes you can take, but what is the most efficient? What is the one that is actually meeting your needs? So what if we build an inside infrastructure which is entirely designed around users? Users are multiple persona, if you like. You have the frontline workers, service providers, you have real people with real issues. So what if the inside infrastructure takes into account all these different users and what they want? And by taking into account, I don't mean let's build an amazing dashboard and then publish it hoping that we're gonna get 200 clicks a week. No. You need to have those individuals around the same table having an open and transparent debate. The people who are experiencing poverty, of course, this is where I'm coming from, working for the JRF Foundation, but also those who are really willing to provide good advice based on good evidence, making decisions based on good data that has been streamlined and processed and made accessible in the first place. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring together different actors, even before we commit money to building anything. That's why we work directly with people with lived experience to make sure that the information that we put out there collectively, collaboratively, as a purpose, is respectful of their different experiences, identities, and characteristics, but also as a rationale behind it as to why we're doing this in the first place. We need to be clear what the data is needed for and how is this data is going to be used moving forward. But why data? We talk so much about data. Well, data is information, right? Information is knowledge. Knowledge is power. But I want to emphasize the fact that it's not just power for those who are already in a position of power. It should be, in the first place, power for the people the data describes and referred to. So again, we talk about gaps. How can we try our best to, acknowledge those gaps and do something about it? One of the issues we often experience in the sector is there is data available out there. You can go onto the ONS website, plenty of statistics about people, places, and so forth. It's not timely. It doesn't really reflect the current situations. This is why we're trialing different things. My colleague Modi in the panel this morning mentioned the cost of living tracker, but also the work that we're doing with GPAC. Are we looking at the right information? Is this the type of information that we should put out there? Or maybe are we missing something? What are those gaps? What can we do about those gaps? It's not really inclusive. It's not really representative. You take any, family survey or even some of the characteristics that we talk about before about those in need of accessing advice. Well, surprise, surprise, that in the vast majority of cases, those belonging to minority groups or those living in the most deprived area are not there. It's just a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of what the information that the data describe in the first place. So this is all to say that it's not all doom and gloom, but there is a responsibility for foundations like JRF, also government and other actors to actually invest time and resources in this. We can facilitate moving from what is a very slow system into something that could serve and accommodate the needs of very diverse audiences. We need to acknowledge the fact that a one-off grant is not going to cut it, it's not going to do the trick. We need to commit to multi-years investment, and also we need to be a lot more open to failure. There's no guarantee this is going to work, but we need to try. Otherwise, things are not going to change. It's 2023, and we're still talking about the same issues that we had many, many years ago. Most of us are still using Excel, nothing wrong with it, don't judge me. But can you see why, if we don't stick to the, a common set of standards that we all agree to, we try to use the best tools available? I mean, there is AI and machine learning out there. Why we're not using it? Why it's only down to evil corporations to make, profit out of that? We should totally invest in that. There's also good corporations, by the way. They're not all evil. But this is to say that we need to do something about it. And, many of the stories that we heard today, the commitments, they're all moving in the right direction. We need to do things faster. Now it's more than ever the time to actually act on this, and to build many inside infrastructure, as many as needed, to enable everyone to at least have a much more decent experience, whether it's the justice system or, the kind of society overall, and enable everyone to be at the same level and to be recognized and acknowledged by a system that quite often, unfortunately, failed to support people in the right way. As promised, I'm going to stop here. Otherwise, I'm going to go on forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now I'd like to open it out to the floor, and I'd be particularly interested to hear if anyone in the room has any experience, or like how these issues, how the points that the panel have made resonate with you in your own experience, particularly those who work in the front line. Are there particular issues with data that have hampered the work you want to do? Are there anything? Please.
I've got an example of where data is actually starting to be really helpful in the employment space. So I think in employment, one of the objectives in terms of access to justice, one of the ideal scenarios would be actually reducing the need for access to justice, because the opposite of needing access to justice in employment is actually good work and facilitating an environment where people are have a work which minimum standards are complied with. And last week at our monthly meeting, we had an organisation called Violation Tracker come along. I don't know whether you've heard of them, but it's a website which basically tracks all of the, well, not all yet, but hopefully all soon, but a lot of the judgments where essentially employers have lost cases in the employment tribunal, but also in the enormous amount of bodies which actually deal with employment infringement, so the HMRC's minimum wage team, the GLLA and more. And the really interesting thing about this is, so the purpose of the meeting was to first of all find out a little bit about this tool, to see how easy it is to use, and it's really easy and it's free to use, and you can all go on there and play with it and see if your employer's on there, which I did, which is quite funny. But actually, the other really interesting thing is one of the pieces of work that we were doing this week was working with the 12 councils in the centre of London in their understanding of what good work is. And what we've said to them is, do not place people into jobs if the organisations you're placing them into are listed on here when they haven't told you what they're going to do about the underlying abuse that they have in the labour market. And actually, the person who runs this Violation Tracker UK immediately went off our call and went to look at the Mayor's Good Work Standard, which lists the 140 employers who have apparently reached the Mayor's Good Work Standard. And guess what? Quite a lot of them were also listed in the employment infringement. And I think it's just an interesting way to, obviously we all want better access to justice, but that budget, particularly for employment, isn't coming. So actually we have to look at the use of data in different ways. I think that kind of looking at the problem before and thinking, well, that's another way of doing it. I just wanted to share it with you.
That's a lovely example. Thank you so much. Does anyone else have anything you'd like to, reflections or thoughts? Hi, Sue. Lovely to be.
Right, thank you. I gave evidence this week to the Renters Reform Coalition, on behalf of the Renters Reform Coalition, to the Bills Committee. And what struck me the most about thinking about the Renters Reform is that a lot of what we're looking at is to try and get rid of bad landlords. And one of the ideas is to have a property portal. And the government are looking at what information should go in there. And it seemed to me that as much information as possible, and following on from Victoria's point about, you know, information about bad landlords, have they had orders against them, you know, kind of have as much information as possible in that. And then secondly, we want to get rid of section 21, which is the no fault eviction. There's a massive issue because the government are delaying that, because it seems to me, having worked in the courts a long time, it takes a long time for the bailiff's warrant to come, and that kind of delay. So that's kind of about money. But essentially, the new grounds for possession are going to be that the landlord wants the property back for their own use, or the family's use, or they want to sell. And the issue that we want to raise in that, and this is why data will be really important, is what do we do after that? So landlord comes along and says, I want to sell the property, but does the landlord then sell? Are they just getting rid of the tenant? And I think this is a really good way with a new Act of Parliament where we can get data in to protect. And so that I just thought that would be really relevant right now.
That's brilliant, Sue. Thank you so much. And it would be lovely to hear the panel's reflections on solutions, because obviously, and I know from Lex's experience, one of the only solution really to the problem that you're experiencing is a change to legislation. And I think what Sue's arguing for there is, how do we ensure that the legislation contains provisions to ensure the collection of data? I wonder if anyone else had any reflections on how we go about fixing this problem, and whose responsibility is it? You know, is it funders? Is it government? Is it, you know, intermediaries? What's the ecosystem that we need to move towards better data? Lisa.
I do think we need a data strategy for the justice system, and we have those strategies for health. We have them for education. They're not easy to do, because you're balancing, you know, the rights of citizens to their individual data. There's a lot of data protection issues to think through. But you know, that is a government responsibility, I think, to lead that. I think that's has to be an MOJ responsibility. So, and I think there's a real danger in us trying to sort of devise our own strategies independently, and a lot of wasted resource. So I do think we need some sort of way of bringing that together. I'll just mention on the family justice side, because Natalie and I have been involved in discussions through the president of the family division, who's got a real agenda to try and make the family courts more transparent. He set up a sort of data subgroup to look at this issue, and we are looking to map the current data that is available in family justice and to expose the gaps in order to start a conversation about the need for a strategy. But I think it's really important that is joined up with your efforts in civil justice and other parts of the justice system, and owned by MOJ. And at the moment, it's very difficult to find the traction within MOJ for this kind of strategy.
I'd like to come in next.
Thanks. I totally agree, Lisa, in relation to a data strategy for justice. But I think, and there's, of course, for those who don't know now, a digital justice strategy, which was released recently, and would there be an opportunity there to try and join the two up, should there be two things that exist like that? But I think the thing that really struck me just in the last session was asking myself the question, listening to particularly your colleague Maudie, Rosario, and indeed Emma, was whether we got the right people in the room to actually solve some of the problems in the first place. What we're talking about is when things are failing, and this is where the justice system gets to step in. So I think in terms of a justice strategy, yes, but I think we need to find ways, and I know there are people in this room thinking about it within the MOJ, to try and think about what the other government departments are worrying about, what data they're gathering, and to try and stem as much as possible through understanding data and gathering the right bits, getting all the right people in the room, many of the points that the panel have said, to ensure that we're actually reducing the problem we're all talking about. So I think there's something about join up. I think when creating new policies, when creating new processes, so I'm going to set some thoughts on solution, I'll be really quick. And certainly when you're thinking about legislation, so you've just brought up a recent bill that's in Parliament at the moment. we all have a duty to demand that there is consideration of what data requirements there are sitting behind the intent of those policies and those legislation. I gave a very small example of where there wasn't that kind of thinking in relation to behaviour control orders, and others have done something given very similar, very compelling examples too. And I think with that comes, dare I say, does there need to be a bit more training to understand what data requirements look like, what is possible for those who are responsible for putting together those policies and processes? I, for one, would have loved to have had more understanding and more knowledge and more awareness. I had access to great analysts, but that's not necessarily always feasible. Would I have benefited as a policymaker in government from more of that? The answer is definitely yes. And I think that data standards, you've touched on that already, 100%, Natalie, it's one of your expert areas for sure. And I think that, again, Rosario, you touched on this, the need to be able to make this information accessible so that people can do that cycle of then demanding more information because they understand it more. So data we have to find ways to be really good communicators in terms of explaining what the data is showing and why it matters and how it can change things.
Yes, thank you. When Rosario was speaking earlier, I was sort of scribbling down a couple of notes, and just my thoughts on data strategy more generally is that I think it's still only relatively recently that people started to think that there was a value to data. I think it's still not appropriately valued, and it's still probably not appropriately understood. I would sound a little bit of a note of caution, just through personal painful experience, on codifying too explicitly the types of data that ought to be collected. I refer there to the statutory instrument that governs how the Registry Trust gets run, because it's that limits us from obtaining claimant data. So obviously when that was passed in 2005, that's completely fine because nobody saw the purpose of having claimant data on the public register. Now people do, but actually getting that change through is like pushing a boulder uphill. It's painfully slow. So I would absolutely sound a note of caution on that. And the final point, I think, would be just to reflect on some of the conclusions from the very first session this morning, which is actually around the need for collegiate working on this. And it goes over and above the justice system. Civil justice in particular touches so many different sections in society. It can't be a justice system data strategy. It does need to integrate into different areas of society as well. Otherwise, I think it will always be limited in terms of its interpretation and delivery.
Thank you so much, Lex. That was brilliant. And I think what you said there speaks to Rosario's point about the need for responsive infrastructures that can, because what users need from data changes over time, the importance of having these intermediaries there that can help respond to that. And I'd be interested if anyone had any reflections on where that should sit in government. We heard a lot in the first session about the role for the private sector in the new digital justice system. And obviously there's potential for that to make it more difficult to capture consistent data. The Briggs model that was talked about is the online court. It's very easy to set data standards when you own the infrastructure and the technology. When that's being devolved out to private companies, it's harder to set those standards. And in Rosario, some of the work that you've been looking at is how do you get consistent data from other sources where data isn't collected in a structured way, but for example, it's on online forums or other things. Like how do you turn unstructured data into structured data? Would you be able to reflect a bit on that and some things that you learned from that project?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so just to give you a bit of a context, a couple of projects that we are prototyping at the moment for the inside infrastructure is one is social media listening. So it's data scraping from different forums, places that people in need go to share their own experiences, but also learn from others. And as you can imagine, it's a huge amount of information. So how do you do that? Machine learning. But before, you need to instruct the machine in the first place, right? What is that you're looking for? What is important? What is not important? truth be told, is not our place to say just at Rowntree, but we do have access to people with lived experience. So what is really important, what does resonate with their own experience? Can we then create categories and streamline data that is very complex and high in volumes to make sure that we're looking at the right things, not what we believe is the issue and a possible solution. Alongside that, we're running something else called Grounded Voices. It's a panel made of around 150 people with direct experience of poverty, hardship, and so forth across the UK. We are essentially, we have established an open channel of communication with them through tasks. We interact through apps and, you know, daily diaries and things like that. Again, we're trying to we create a space for people, again, real people, to help us understand what's going on across the country. And then what do we do with that information? I think that's something you referred to before. We start triangulating. And what we do once we do the triangulation, and we have yet another list of key issues, experiences, data, and so forth. Well, we have also access to GPAC, the Grassroots Poverty Action Group. Again, people with lived experience who are able to tell us, yes, this is what we are going through. Actually, no, this is not a priority for us. So what we're doing is we establish a bit of an infrastructure, pun unintended, to actually be able to not just triangulate information that is, you know, high volume, complex, but also to validate. So that validation exercise is not our job because we don't have direct experience of poverty, at least the vast majority of people working in the charity sector. But we can create the conditions for those who know about those issues firsthand to be able to say, yes, this is true, this is very important, this is relevant, or actually this doesn't matter to us. And so this is just one example, but I also want to bring in another example, which is we talk about the justice system. I think there is something already happening within MOJ, which could be a good example when it comes to data standards, how you bring together people from different backgrounds into what could be an advisory group. I don't know if you ever heard about the Justice Data Lab. It's been going on for quite a while now. And what they do is they triangulate data that is not available publicly because it's very sensitive information and data collected by charities. So there are systems and infrastructures in place that we can learn from. We don't have to invent something new just for the sake of it, but maybe some of the answers are already there, the standards and how you enable data sharing across different organizations and so forth. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to bring, we had a couple of questions from online. So I had one from Fran who says that her work is severely hampered by the way data is not disaggregated by country. Given devolution, it's vital to have data specifically for Wales. And I think the work that FJO has done on regional variations in data shows how important it is to have data at that local level. And one from Dr Jane Krishnadas at Clock Heel, and she has a question for Lisa about whether it's possible to collate national stats or public and private crossover cases between public and private family law. This is born of recognition that in the cases that Clock see, 30% of their private law Clock cases also have local authority involvement. So what are the prospects for that?
So it is possible through linked data. So, you know, now that we have these big admin data sets, and there is this initiative in MOJ with Data First to make those admin data sets available. Through the power of linkage, you can then look across systems and see where people are appearing in public and private law proceedings. I would say that we are much further ahead in Wales than we are in England at the moment, and the Welsh Government has shared a lot of its data with the Sale Data Bank at Swansea University, which means you can use that data bank to link data within Wales. It's a smaller country, but it's, you know, far ahead of England in that regard. We have to, I think, to your point about working collaboratively across government, we have to have this conversation across government, because understanding the data sets that the DFE hold about families is critical in public law, as well as understanding, you know, the experience of DWP data for a lot of the clients in civil law. So that there is the prospect of that, but it does require individual government departments to be willing to share its data and make it linkable. And I think, you know, again, the Office of National Statistics can play a big role in facilitating some of that if government departments are willing to do that.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm Sarah Stevens. I'm a trustee of the Access to Justice Foundation, and other things I do as well is look at different models of justice service delivery, whether it's digital or mediation or different services like that. And one thing that I think we keep struggling about is how to articulate what we're measuring and how we measure access to justice. Because we spend a lot of time measuring how many people we've advised or how many people have used the tool, but then to then track, if you think the theory of change, you know, and then to track the outputs and the outcomes and the impact and what our results are and how we're, and to collect that data to therefore make the case for why we should be spending on access to justice and why it's really helping bring a social change and social impact. So I just wondered if you had any suggestions around how we map that journey and how we collect that sort of more holistic impact data and what we should be doing, should we be building, how we can build that into our services.
I'm going to let others answer in relation to mapping because they're far better experts in the panel, but I would say from a policy perspective, and others have said this before, so this is not a new idea, but going to where the purse strings lie is often a very good idea. So explaining to people in the Treasury who have to think about, for example, a billion different things, literally, I think there's a real opportunity there to inform and educate and to explain to people whose problem it is on their desk on a daily basis to work out how they reduce the bottom line. And I think that even if we can do that in narrative, that's a good starting point, and then hopefully it'll be backed up by.
Happy to take this one. That's okay. So I'm a big fan of less is more. You don't need like a huge amount of data to be able to say, you know, this is the kind of difference that we're making. So this is from my days as consultant. I used to work at NPC before joining JRF. There is a very simple framework, which is called 5 types of data: users, engagement, feedback, outcome, impact. Now, my personal opinion in it is that it's almost impossible to measure impact. Don't quote me on that, but feel free to, because there are so many co-variables. Can you actually say attribute a particular long-term change as a result of what you've done? Probably not. Okay, so let's park impact for a second. But you can collect information, you probably already do, about the users, right? You know about the engagement, right? Or how often they interact with whatever service platform advice you are providing. What is their experience? Are you doing the right thing? Is it a positive experience, a negative experience? Are they likely to recommend that particular service to somebody else? An outcome, that's easier to manage because to monitor, because it's a kind of short-term change that you want to see. So did they manage to get to the end point of that journey? And then you can start tracking who else is doing work in that space. If you want to expand and look at the ecosystem and see, okay, there are other avenues that people in need of support or advice can explore and so forth. But less is more. You don't need a huge amount of data to be able to say with a good degree of confidence that you are moving in the right direction. That's my opinion and experience, of course.
Thank you so much, Rosario. That was brilliant. And obviously, I'm slightly biased to have some experience of doing this for the court service and putting together a definition of access to justice and then defining empirical measures that the court service could use to monitor that. I think one of the things that we need to adapt to is, as we heard this morning, as we're increasingly looking at earlier resolution at the role for private providers, it's clear that the kind of policy framework around civil justice is moving to a place where we're not really talking about access to justice, we're talking about access to settlement and how we measure that and how we ensure that settlement is in line with access to justice values around accountability and redress. I think that's a big issue that we're all going to need to have a broader conversation about. One of the things that we're going to try and do in the first CJC report is to suggest some measures for access, fairness and efficiency, because those are our statutory objectives, and suggest in real terms, you know, how we might measure that within systems and what data we have to speak to those concepts. But you're exactly right, Sarah. Part of the problem that we've had in capturing data to date has been a lack of definitional clarity around what exactly it is that we're trying to measure, but that looks different in different circumstances. We're now 3 minutes over time, so I just want to say thank you again so much to the brilliant panel for giving up time to be here today, and thank you to all of you. It's so wonderful. I've been giving presentations on data at the CJC for I think the past 5 years, and it is somewhat heartening to see that the number of people attending grows year on year. So that is lovely. And just the lessons we need to tackle: leadership, legislation, funding, and we need to leverage tech in clever ways to improve insights from what we have as well if we're serious about fixing the problem. But thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of your day.
So sorry.